back to the studio, quilting peeps. Today we're going to be talking about something that I haven't talked about before, and that is digital quilting. We know that there are a lot of different ways to quilt things. There's the classic traditional way, which was hand quilting, and you will probably never see me do that here because it's just something that I've never found that I enjoy doing. We have quilting on the domestic machine, and we have quilting on the long arm machine. Those could both be done with the tearaway pantograph designs, which Urban Elements has a wide selection of. They could be done both with utilizing quilting stencil, which would be the same thing that hand quilters used, marking the image on the quilt and then using that to follow along on the domestic or the long arm machine. There are design boards. The design boards are usually used exclusively on a long arm machine. I'm not sure how you could utilize one of those on a domestic machine. And then we have pantographs. Pantographs are designs that generally used from the back of a long arm machine, but again, some of the same designs are used on the tearaway papers, so those could be utilized on both the domestic and long arm machine. What we're going to be talking about today is digital, and I'm going to be using a digital file that is going to be running a robotic system on an Intelliquilter. An Intelliquilter is something that I recently acquired, and I've just gone through the process of getting it set up. With the COVID protocols, I had to do most of the installation myself with just some email help and some phone calls. But I do have my Intelliquilter set up on the Bernina Q24, and we're going to do the very first quilt on there. Now, I've done some playing on some scrap fabric. It's just some plain fabric with batting and backing, just to stitch out some designs, see if the machine is stitching properly. I had to do some testing on the Intelliquilter to get it calibrated to make sure that the motor strength was in the proper range. We did a drift test and a line test. All of those have passed. So my next challenge is to actually put a quilt on there and get the quilt to stitch out with the design lining up the way it's supposed to. So I may get this done without a hitch, or we may find that I have a little problem in my understanding of how the process works. But we're going to try it anyway. I have to start somewhere, and so this is basically going to be me learning how to use the Intelliquilter system, the IQ, which is fairly user-friendly. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stitch this quilt out. This particular quilt is a beautiful jewel tone log cabin quilt. I didn't piece this. I believe this was pieced by one of my quilting mentors, Bernina. When she passed away, I was able to get a hold of some of her stuff that her husband was not keen to hold on to. So I'm going to go ahead and try this. I have a beautiful jewel tone backing fabric to match. It was a extra wide backing that I got on sale, so I was able to cut it specifically to the size I needed so there won't be any seams in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and get my backing, batting, and the top loaded on the frame, and then we're going to work on loading quilt design, which I haven't even chosen yet, and loading the thread and getting a pattern stitched out. So let's get started. I have my quilt top and I have the backing fabric. I've already washed this and dried it. I have it cut to size. It's about 5 inches wider on each side than it needs to be. And I've chosen two colors of isocord thread. I'm going to use the green on the top and the blue on the back. That's just what I chose. I really like that green color to bring out the green in the leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and get my back loaded and the batting and get the thread loaded on the machine and some bobbins wound, and we're going to get to starting to quilt. I have my backing fabric pinned onto my leaders, both the take-up leader and the top leader. I pin from the center out with the pins facing in that direction, and from the center and this way with the pins facing in that direction. That way, if I'm smoothing out the leader or the quilt on the rollers, I don't catch my hands on the pins and then bleed, which I have done in the past. That's why I switched to doing the pinning in that way. I also utilize these clips. These clips come from Quilters Apothecary, and Jamie Wallen is one of our digital panto designers as well as a paper panto designer. These clips I like because they hold the excess edges of the leaders nice and tight as I'm rolling up. I did put the tattoos on them from Urban Elements, the tattoo elements, just because I like the colors of them. So I have my clips in place, my leaders are tight, I have my backing fabric on with the backing facing down, and the next thing to do for me is to go ahead and cut my batting and to get it basted onto the quilt backing. Now I always like to use batting that is almost exactly the same width as my backing. And the reason I do that is when you roll up the quilt, if there's an even layer all the way across, you're not going to get sagging on the two edges. Now you can compensate for that by reserving strips of batting that you've cut off and lay those on the two edges as you're rolling it up, just to keep the backing from getting slack. But I just always cut the batting the size of the backing, and I just consider that a part of the cost of quilting. I don't like to scrimp too much on the process because it always creates problems down the road, and as expensive as all of this stuff is, I don't want to try and waste dollars and save pennies. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my batting almost to the exact size as the width of my backing, and we're going to get that basted in place. Before I loaded my quilt backing, I always take a ruler and I measure in from the top edge about 2.5 inches, and I create a straight line all the way across the top of the back side of the backing. I also give myself a vertical line where the center is of the backing. And you can see here this heavily dotted line on my leader is the center of my quilt leader. So I have a line here that represents that the center of my backing is lining up with the center of my leader, and I have a faint line there that's just dark enough for me to see that I'm going to line up my batting with. And my batting also has a mark where the center of the batting is. So I'm going to use this edge to line up my batting, and I'm going to run a basting stitch across the whole length of it, starting from the center and working out. And just as a little tip, if you want, you could do a quick spritz across this line of 505, which would just help keep your batting in place. Also, when you smooth it, it would really have it nice and tight to the fabric before you even baste it. Sometimes I'll even do that along the edges as I'm basting the edge of the top down. But I'm going to go ahead and get the batting in place, then I'll lay the top on there. This is a cotton batting. It's been needle punched, and what that means is they took the batting and they punched needles through there. I imagine that there's a bunch of needles all at once punching through there, and you can see on one side, which would have been the top of the batting when they did the procedure, has little dimples in it, and that's where the needle penetrated through the batting. And on the back side, if you can't see it, you can almost feel it. There's little tiny, it almost feels like little tiny balls or little pimples. That is the bottom side, and what we want to do when we put the batting on the quilt is to layer it in the same way it was needle punched. So this was the top when it was needle punched. I can see all the little tiny micro dimples, and this is the back side. I can feel or see all of the little pimples. That part faces down. So we have our batting basted in place, and now we're going to go ahead and lay our quilt top in place using the same procedure that we did a moment ago with the batting. It's kind of amazing to me. A lot of times fabric looks so dated, and I know that this quilt top is at least 15 years old. In fact, it's probably much older, but it looks like really current fabric because those jewel tones are so vibrant. This is a log cabin quilt, and there are 6 log cabin blocks across, and they were symmetrical log cabin blocks. They weren't offset. And so I know that the seam between the 3 blocks and the 3 blocks would be the center. I could have measured that, but I am trusting the piecing of the quilt. If it's off 1/4 of an inch, that's not going to make a huge difference for me. But I have a pin in place, and I've got the center of my quilt top lined up again with that line on my backing and on my leader, so that I know that I'm going to position this quilt top in the center. And I'm going to go ahead and baste the top edge of this quilt onto the batting and the backing. And I may even employ the use of a quick spray of 505 just to help keep that from wrinkling as I'm doing the quilt basting. We are at the beginning, the main menu screen, and I'm going to get ready to input the design that I want to use on the quilt now. So I'm going to select Design Sew Quilt and Start New. It's going to ask me 3 questions. One of them is, I have a work in progress, do I want to replace it? And the answer is yes, because the previous was just a test. It's asking me if I want to permanently erase it, and again, I'm going to hit erase because it was just a test. And now I have my project time and my stitching time. Ask me if I want to reset that so I know how long this particular project lasts, and I'll hit reset. And that just gets me really to the beginning of the screen. Here I can choose whether I want to work on a pantograph or a block or a line pattern and some other additional items, but really I'm just going to focus on a pantograph today. And I can mark the actual measurement of the quilt using the machine, or I could trace on the quilt, or I could enter the rectangle manually from a measurement that I've previously taken. So I'm going to enter rectangle manually. I know that the measurement of the quilt was about 55 by 73, but I'm going to increase that by just an inch so I have a little bit of play on each side, because where it might stitch a straight line, I want to make sure it does that off the quilt. But having said that, I also want to make sure that every row I baste the edges so that it can't lift up the edge of the quilt as it sews off. So because I've previously entered this, it's already coming up 56 by 74, but I'm going to just go ahead and enter it manually. 56, enter, goes down to the height, 74, enter, and now it has, it says I did 774, which we need to clear. So I'm going to hit my height again and do 74 and enter. So now I have 56 by 74. I'm going to continue. It shows again the width and height, and I need to have my machine up here at this upper right hand corner where it's indicated, and that's where my machine is at. So I'm going to hit finished. This is my Urban Elementz design library, and you could search, if you know the name of a pattern, with the search button. I could just arrow through all the different designs that are on here, but I know the name of the design that I want to use today is Meandering Jasmine, and I chose that because there's leaves in the fabric, and I'm just going to bring out that leaf in the panto design. So I'm going to hit M and arrow over till I get Meandering Jasmine. Now this is kind of a funny thing. It allows me to choose different patterns for even and odd rows, and I'm not sure why you would do that, because patterns don't all nest together exactly the same way. So I would choose the same pattern for both even and odd rows. So I'm just going to select Meandering Jasmine again, and you'll see I have all the rows there, but there's a little bit of a gap that looks a little bit like typewriter typing, which I want to eliminate. So I'm going to hit gap, and you can either use the arrow buttons up and down to increase or decrease that gap, or you could actually just touch the screen and drag it until the gap disappears. Now the other thing we have to look at is the row height, and I know that my row height, I believe, is about 10 inches is where you want to be. So you could either choose the plus or minus buttons or the keyboard. And so I'm just going to enter that and have my row height about 10 inches there. And so I'm going to hit finished, and it's updating. There's only one choice here for transition type. It's continuous, so I'm going to accept, and it's reconfirming, so I'm saying yes. And now I want to get to the point where I sew the quilt. And I'm going to select Panto Sequencing Assistance, and I'm going to do the very top row, which is just the tips of some of the leaves. And it's asking me if I want to swap the start and end points. So I could start left to right, and the next row do right to left and back and forth, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to hit continue. And so now it's selected the whole quilt. I could have done these one by one by one, and that is, you can see there's a slight color variation between the two greens. One's more of a Kelly green, one's an olive green. Those are just indicating my rows, and I'm going to go ahead and hit sew quilt, and you can see it's already moving, and we're going to get to my first starting point. And it's asking me to stitch set my stitch length on the machine to manual, which I've done. But now I'm going to stop the camera and zoom out so you can see the entire process as it sews out. It's asking me to set the regulated stitch length with that, which I've done. And now I'm ready to pull up my bobbin thread. And then I can hit my start button. Now that I've hit my start button, what it's going to do is stitch out the entire first row, and you can see the progress of the stitching because the crosshairs indicate where the needle is, and where it is red is where it's already sewn, and where it is green is where it's about to sew. And we can follow this along as it stitches out the entire width of the project. For the entire quilt, the calculated time for this particular project is 103 minutes, and it's just going to continue sewing, and then we'll stop and advance the rows. I would not be tempted to leave the room, even though this is a robotic machine and it's going to stitch out on its own. I would not want to leave this unsupervised in case there was some kind of an obstruction notice, or we ran out of thread, bobbin thread or top thread, or there was any other issue regarding the machine and its operation. So I would stay in the room, certainly, as we were operating the machine, but you can see that we're getting very accurate results on the stitching. The stitch quality looks very pretty, and I have said in the past that I don't like really high contrast thread. Certainly in the beginning when we're learning to do something, I like to give myself a margin of error, and This is my very first quilt that I'm quilting with the IQ, so if I have an issue as I advance the quilt, I want to give myself a little bit of leeway. But you're certainly able to choose stronger contrast threads as you become more adept at using free motion quilting, a pantograph, ruler work, but this is just a good rule of thumb for me. I always like to say that I think about quilting like perfume, and I don't want to smell somebody's perfume. See, we have a thread break. So I don't like to smell somebody's perfume until I get up close, and it's the same with quilting. I don't want to be able to see quilting all the way across the room. I want to see the quilt pattern first. So I'm going to go ahead and rethread the machine, and we'll get this started again and move forward. This is a digital pattern from Elementz. It is a copyright pattern just the way the pantos would be. Even if I alter I load this design and I alter something about it, the design is still a copyrighted pattern. I don't have permission to share this file with somebody else as it is copyrighted. And I really like to respect the designers of these items because this is their livelihood. I particularly love this one. It's very organic and natural looking. It looks really good on this quilt so far. So I kind of enjoy watching it stitch out. It's almost mesmerizing. Now it's working its way off of the camera view, so I'll reposition. We're coming up to the end of the first row, so I believe that when we get off to the edge and it finishes that pattern, it will stop and allow me to advance the quilt, but I'm going to be here at the ready just in case I have done something incorrectly and I need to pause the machine. So we have just a little bit in the corner left, and we'll go down the side a little bit, and then our design will be finished. There is a pause button here in case I need to utilize that. You can see the blue line is my long jump stitch to go to the other pattern, and that's where I would need to pause if anything. Okay, so we have stopped, and we need to raise the needle up and clip the threads, and I will advance the quilt, and I'll have to hit realign because after I roll the quilt up it needs to know where to start again. I have my top belly bar pulled up so I can see underneath the top itself. I've advanced the quilt. If I was doing a paper pantograph, I would have dropped the needle in one of the points of the design and used my laser light to roll up the quilt so that the machine and the quilt rolled back as I was advancing it. With the digital, I don't need to do that. I just need to make sure that I can see part of the previously sewn design and have enough room for the needle to touch one of those points that I could use as a realignment point. So I've made sure my batting is straight, and I'm just going to go ahead and lower my bar and make sure that that is nice and straight, and we'll get everything tightened back up and start seeing if I can advance the design. I moved my machine to my reference point and selected OK, and now it's asking me to set the stitch regulation to manual again. I did have it on the basting function because I basted both edges again. So I'm going to hit continue. Now I should be at the start of my second row. I've already pulled up the thread the bobbin thread, and I should be ready to start. And so this is the beginning of my second row, and hopefully it will sew all the way across without any thread breaks. The thread breaks are really more about my needle and my thread and not the IQ program. I do have that problem sometimes. I keep adjusting tension and working with needle changes. You can see here, this was my previous row, my first row of stitching, and this is my second row of stitching. So you can see there's a nice gap in between, but not too big of a gap. So we do have our realignment done really nicely on this pattern, and we'll continue to sew after the camera gets out of it, or the head of the machine gets out of the way. This is a pretty good view of both the quilt, the head of the machine. This is the touch screen on my Bernina and the touch screen on the IQ. One of the things I like about the IQ system is that the screen is right on top of the head, so you don't have to keep walking back or forth to one end of the frame or the other anytime you need to make an adjustment or see a change. I like to be able to see what is stitching out and how much time I have left, and so far it's stitching out really beautifully. Because I'm used to doing pantographs, the way that I advance the quilt is a little bit different. There's a new metric that I have to pay attention to. Normally when I'm doing a paper pantograph, I would put the needle in the lowest point on a design that's already stitched out, and then advance the quilt until the laser light got to the echo pattern. At any rate, because I center my panto in the back, I never really get too close to the back bar with the head of the machine. But because I'm not using that system, when I advance the quilt, I have to pay attention to just how far this design gets rolled up. So what I know is I need about 2 inches below the lowest part of a design that's already sewn out and the back wall of the machine. So what I do is put a 2-inch mark on the lowest part of the design. I can just lay that there on the quilt, and I'm going to go ahead and unlock my system so I can advance the quilt. And when that ruler gets to the back bar of the frame, right about there, I know I can't go any further, because when the machine is trying to stitch it out, it would hit the back, the dead bar, and give me an obstruction notice, which I don't want. So this is just something new that I have to pay attention to. I will get used to being able to do that visually without the ruler, but it's not something that I've had to pay attention to in the past as far as stitching out a design. Even with free motion quilting, you would know how close you could go, and you usually test those things as you're going. So this is just one more thing I had to learn today, and I'm glad I didn't have an obstruction notice, but I got close to one. So that's why I realized I had to start paying attention to that. I'm at this edge of the quilt. I have already basted both sides, and what I want to do is realign the quilt so that I can get to the next row. So it says touch a reference point on the screen. So I'm going to touch the tip of the leaf from the last piece that I sewed, which is right here. And I'm going to put my needle right over that position. And I'm going to go ahead and touch continue. It says move the needle to the location of the reference point, which I've already done. It's that little leaf of a row that I've already sewn, and I'm going to hit OK. The machine is automatically going to move to the start point of my next row, and it just did a single stitch to allow me to pull up the thread. And I'm going to go ahead and hit start. And that's all there is to it after you've advanced the quilt to get the next row lined up. So it'll automatically sew and interlock the pattern as beautifully as it should. I'm on the final row of my test quilt, This is the first quilt that I've done, and I have a couple things that I have to get a little better at, that I have to perfect, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. All of the rows are in line. That was my main worry. I don't think I put enough length in for the quilt, so the very bottom of the quilt will have a small area that didn't get as quilted off of the quilt as I would have liked. But because the thread matches so well, I don't think anyone would notice that unless they really closely inspected it. Plus the binding is going to cover a portion of that. But I'm going to go ahead and let this finish off. Then I'll take the quilt off of the frame and get it trimmed up. But this is where I'm going to end the video for today. As far as a test quilt, I think it went off pretty smoothly. I did have a couple thread breaks, but generally that has to do with my machine. I know that if I fill my bobbin a little too full, that I usually have problems for the first few minutes of the full bobbin. I try to only fill my bobbin about 5/8 full or 7/8 full, and then I don't generally have a problem. There may be a way to correct that. I haven't found it yet, but I've just learned to live with it. So this is going to be where we leave you. Thanks for stopping in today, and this will probably be the first of many quilts or videos in the digital era, in the digital topic. There's a lot of different ways to play with this new tool, but I'm going to continue to do both ruler work, pantograph work from the back of the machine, free motion work, because I enjoy all of these aspects, and they're just tools in an arsenal to execute what I have in my mind mentally onto the actual fabric. So any tool that I can use to execute that design plan, that's what I'm going to use. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time here in the studio.